Hello, church family. Happy Father's Day. My name is Caleb Reedy, and I invite you to please stand as you are able for today's scripture reading. Our Bible passage this week comes from the New Testament book of Acts, Acts chapter 14, verses 8 through 12. In Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet and had never walked, for he had been crippled from birth. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul looked at him intently, and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated.
Well, good morning, folks. I want to add my welcome to Marcus. And man, what a little intro there. Gosh, Marcus, that was supposed to be an announcement for volunteering for camp, not a mini sermon. I'm like, goodness gracious. That was amazing. Well, friends, today we're continuing the sermon series called The Winding, Wild, Unlikely Journeys of Paul. And so we're going to continue in our Bibles from where Caleb left off. If you have a Bible, there's some on the chairs. We're going to be in Acts chapter 14. If you want to follow along with the red Bible on the chairs, it's on page 1006. And while we get there and find our place, let me recap a little bit. So what we just heard Caleb read was about a guy named Paul. And Paul and his friend Barnabas traveled around the known world about 15 years into the church's existence. They had started these churches around the known world from scratch. Like there were no Christians in these places, and they went and they invited people who had never heard anything even close to this to follow Jesus, and they started these churches that made the Christian movement international instead of just localized. And so in today's reading, Paul and Barnabas have found themselves in Lystra. And what's interesting in this passage is you can kind of tell Lystra isn't Jewish. It's a Roman colony. It's in today's modern day Turkey. And the people there would have been much more familiar with like the Greek and Roman pantheon, which, as you heard in the text, they actually thought after Paul and Barnabas heal this guy, they think that they're Zeus and Hermes. And so they actually think that Barnabas is Zeus and Paul is Hermes. Just to put it in context, I found ancient statues of these two deities. They have a little less clothes than I would have chiseled on them, but the guy with the beard is Zeus. Hermes is Zeus's son in the old pantheon, and so I'm guessing, I never thought of this before, but I'm guessing Barnabas was a little older and Paul was a little younger than Barnabas. And so this is who they're mistaking these guys for, like actual deities come down. So I want to continue from there, and we're in chapter 14, verse 13 at this point. So again, page 1006 here. So, continuing verse 13, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates. He and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. They wanted to literally worship them. And it continues, when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and they rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We are mortals just like you. And we bring you good news that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to follow their own ways, and yet he has not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling you with food and your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. But the Jews came there from Antioch and Iconium and won over the crowds. And then they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples surrounded him, he got up and he went back into the city. The next day, he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. What is this story? Isn't this something else in the Bible? I mean, what is this story? These folks go from worshiping Paul and Barnabas to stoning Paul and thinking that they've killed him. What a day in the life of Paul. So, when I was preparing today's message and I was going through the text, I just kept coming back to something in this story. Yes, there's this huge swing between the extremes of the crowd's response. But what I kept coming back to was the crowd. And it made me realize that their responses actually cover this range that human beings are capable of. That we often, when we are able to treat people in this way, that we either make them more than human or less than human. And this is what the crowd does. They don't really know what to do with Paul and Barnabas. And so they, at first, treat them more than human, and then they treat them less than human. They put them on pedestals, saying they must be gods. And then, a few verses later, they essentially put him on trial, and they say this man deserves to die. And on Father's Day, I think this is a helpful picture for how many of us relate to our fathers. And I know that sounds dramatic, but think about it. We either put our dads on a pedestal or we put them on trial. Some of us idolize our fathers. Dad might have been the strongest, the smartest, the funniest, the most dependable guy in the world. He could fix anything, grill anything. By the way, I did my first grilling session yesterday. I felt very proud of myself. He could drive anywhere without directions. He showed up to every game. I mean, Dad might be amazing. Others of us, we find ourselves vilifying our fathers. Maybe we remember the absence or the anger, or the criticism, or the pain, or the things they said, or the things they never said, or the moments they missed, or the wounds that they left. And, in the same way that Paul is worshipped and then hated, both of these extremes can miss the mark when it comes to our dads. Because Paul wasn't more than human, and he wasn't less than human, and your dad, living or dead, biological or not, is not more than human. He's not less than human. And you might be a dad here today thinking, well, between the two of those, I would rather be on the pedestal. Is it really that bad? You might be thinking, gosh, I wish I had the problem of somebody treating me as more than human. And so why don't we start there? Let's talk about the pedestal dad. When we put someone on a pedestal, we stop seeing them clearly. I don't know if you figured this out. This is true of just people in general. We can do this with leaders. You ever see someone that treats a leader like they can do no wrong? They're beyond human. We can do this with people we fall in love with. Have you or someone you know never just been unable to see the true person in front of them, but instead they're in love with the idea of the person? We do this with celebrities and athletes. I have literally had dreams in my life. This is so corny. I've had dreams in my life where I was having dinner with a famous pastor, and then I woke up and I'm like, I'm not special enough to have dinner. Like these are my fantasies. I'm sorry, but here's the thing: like we can do this with dads too. We can make them into something beyond human. The reason I even am mentioning this today is I know that I'm speaking to a select group of people here because not all of us have dads like this. Some of us are like, I wish I had that problem. But when you've got a great dad, what can actually happen is it feels like they're this constant in your life. They can feel like they're there emotionally, they're there to offer support and guidance whenever needed. They might have resources and safety nets for you. They might be practicing virtues in your life that like no one else embodies. My wife has this dad. Randy is just been this dependable rock in their life. Oh my gosh, he's like this incredible, consistent guy, always available, always there. And if you have this dad, you get used to this dad. You rely on this dad. It's almost like they're part of the pantheon themselves. They represent more than a father when you get to live with this. They might even be considered like a force of nature in your life. And so what can happen, though, is that when you have a great dad like this, and then they're less than perfect, in that moment, you can feel betrayed. And that seems like a really nuanced thing, but follow me here for a second. When a pedestal dad falls short, makes a mistake, says the wrong thing, gives bad advice, forgets something important, gets tired, gets cranky, handles a situation poorly, it can be shocking. It can be shocking because no one's used to that. And it's not even that they maybe did anything catastrophic, but because you believed that dad was beyond that and above mistakes, above weaknesses, above needing grace. And so when that kind of dad drops the ball, it can feel like a personal attack. And when that happens, your response can sometimes be resentment or bitterness or anger to something that might have been actually something really slight. It reminds me of a comedian who was talking about going on a flight one day. And this was back when Wi-Fi on airplanes wasn't a thing. And so it was the first flight he had ever taken, and there was Wi-Fi on the plane. And they're offering it free, and he got to log in and like be on his phone. And he's like, this is amazing. We're literally sitting in a chair in a tube flying through the sky, and I'm on my phone connected to people like around the world. Like what an incredible invention. And then after a while, the Wi-Fi stopped working. And people were furious. They're like, this is ridiculous. Why can't they make the Wi-Fi work? And his point was, a few minutes ago, you didn't even know the Wi-Fi existed. And now you're angry. It's not perfect. This is like having a good dad. It is a real gift. Not everybody gets a great dad. When you have a great dad who then gets something wrong, it can be easy to respond like the folks who are upset about the Wi-Fi on the plane. Like you might be frustrated. It'd be great if he was actually perfect, but maybe this is also an opportunity to stop and remember, like, wait a second, I'm flying through the sky connected to people around the world. Like, I have a good father. What a gift. And that actually is the truth here. Is it a gift? It's not a guarantee. It's not a right. It's not something you're entitled to. Man, if you've got a great dad, what a gift. And here's the thing. That doesn't mean that your feelings don't matter when he drops the ball, but sometimes our disappointment from great dads really stems not from the thing that happened, but because of our expectations that we've placed upon a great dad. And the truth is, your great dad is an imperfect person. He is. Remember what Paul and Barnabas said when people were like, they're gods. He said, we are mortals just like you. And this is such an important line. Also, I'm so glad they actually went this way. We're mortals. We're human. We have limits. We have fears. We have blind spots. We have wounds. Like, even the best dads are just mortal. So, if this is your relationship with your dad, best thing you can do is actually take him off the pedestal. Like, just let him be a human being. Let's let him be a person. You can admire that person. You can honor them, but let them be human. Give them some grace and be grateful that they screwed up so infrequently that you even had the opportunity to put them on a pedestal in the first place. But the story continues, right? Because that's only half of the story, is that they're worshiping these guys, right? But the crowds in Lystra don't stop at making Paul more than human. The people from that same town take Paul and they stone him and they throw him outside the city. And so now I want to take some time to talk about the stoned dad. Out of context, this slide is very confusing. And I just want to get a little nerdy with you guys here. There are 4 possibilities when it comes to the stone dad, and just follow me, and hopefully this stuff makes sense. So I want to bring up a chart here, right? Like, here are the 4 possibilities when it comes to the stone dad, right? You can have somebody who's innocent, like Paul, and Paul was innocent. He didn't actually do anything wrong to these people, and yet he fits in the innocent and stoned category, right? There are also people who are innocent and they're not stoned. Again, out of context. This is, we're going to be very confused. If this clip goes on social media, okay, never mind. All right. Then we have guilty, people who are guilty, who have done something wrong. And then we have people who are guilty and they are not stoned. There is no consequence for there were no ramification for their wrongdoing. And then there's people who are guilty and they are stoned. So from a basic fairness perspective, two of these make sense. Two of these are fair. And it looks like this. If you're innocent and you're not stoned, that's fair. And if you're guilty and you're stoned, that's fair. The other two aren't really fair. It's not fair for an innocent person to get stoned. It's not really fair for a guilty person to not get stoned. Like, these things are both unfair. And this is where we find Paul. Paul does not deserve what happens to him. The crowd is wrong. The violence is wrong. But then there's the other category, where if someone is guilty, we think, well, now the stoning makes sense. They're guilty and they should be stoned. And this is actually, we have this scenario play out in front of Jesus. In John chapter 8, a woman is brought before Jesus after being caught in adultery. And the religious leaders are ready to stone her. And what's interesting in this story is, last I checked, it took 2 people to participate in adultery. But you know who they bring before Jesus? The woman. Yeah, no comment there. But do you know what Jesus does in this moment? They go to pick up stones and stone her for this wrongdoing that she's done here. And Jesus looks around and he says, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw the stone at her." And one by one, they drop their stones and they walk away. And it turns out that Jesus isn't a fan of stoning, even when it's justified. And so the way Jesus sees this chart is a little different than what is fair. Do you like my use of emojis here? For Jesus, innocent and not stoned, good. Innocent and stoned, not good. We would agree. But then when it comes to guilty and not stoned, we agree, right? But guilty and stoned, not the way of Jesus. Even though this is fair by the way our world sees things. Jesus isn't just against unfair stoning, he's against stoning, period. Where am I going with this? It's because Jesus is against destroying people. Jesus is against harming people. So when we talk about our fathers, even the ones that are guilty, this matters. Some dads are in the innocent and stoned category. Let me talk about this for a second. I have debated even talking about this at all because it is right borderline on the idea of dismissing someone's experience or someone's claims. And so I want to be careful with how we talk about this today, right? Because if someone picks up a stone, there's usually a really good reason why they've picked up that stone. So who are we to judge if someone is saying that their father is worthy of a stone? And to that I would say, none of us have the right to tell someone they're being unfair to their dad. But you can look into yourself and decide if you're actually being unfair to the father in your life. And I know this because I've done this. In my own life, I've made huge judgments against people that in the moment made me feel incredible hurt and pain. I felt legitimate pain from something that I perceived them to have done. And then I've seen in my own life my response being I either gossip or I've hated someone, I've cut them off. And then as time passed, what happened for me, and I'm just speaking personally, is I realized later that I may have made some assumptions about a situation and acted out of emotion instead of acting out of the truth of the reality of the situation. You know, there are scenarios in my life where I've been sensitive about something, and now I see when I look back that it actually was my unhealthy response in that moment. Sometimes I've cut off someone in my life for a period of time, and that person was actually a blessing in my life. They just insulted me in some capacity. And so I actually lost more by cutting them off than if I had offered grace in a situation and continued to have their presence in my life. You know, I'll tell a personal story here. In my 20s, this is a dating story. I usually try to stay away from more than 2 dating stories in 2 Sundays, but you know, in my 20s, I had a long journey to finding my partner, and so I was in this relationship, and I was having a conversation with my stepdad Tom, and I remember I was talking about this relationship, and he very politely expressed, he's like, I don't think this is somebody you should be in a relationship with. I don't think you're going to be happy ultimately. I don't think this is the kind of person you want to make a long-term commitment to. You know, I'm just sharing, and I was so mad. I was so mad at him that I didn't talk to my parents for a year. For a year. And then I realized, when I look back, he wasn't trying to insult me. He wasn't trying to rub my face in anything. He was just trying to legitimately offer some advice that he was concerned about. That's it. He was concerned. And for his concern, I cut him out of my life for a year. Now, these days, I give that guy a whole lot more grace. He can say almost anything. I might disagree with it. Most of the time, I realize after the fact that he's right. This absolutely happens to some of us, and it can happen to us and our dads. And here's what I just want to share, as I'm not trying to dismiss anyone's experience here. However, all of us can probably think of a moment where we overreacted to something that actually was not as big of a deal as we felt it was in the moment. This absolutely happens to fathers, and it happens to all sorts of people. I want to share a scripture that might help with this. Proverbs 18:17, it says this: the first person to testify seems innocent until the other comes and cross-examines him. So what's this saying is, like, when you're hearing someone testify in court, and they share a story, and they're like, oh my gosh, that must be the truth. That sounds so compelling. And then someone says, really, what time of day was it when that happened? Oh, who did you call? Oh, who was it? And then when you start realizing that you start asking some questions about this story, it starts to fall apart a little bit, right? It doesn't seem as truthful. It doesn't seem as much of a representation of what's the actual truth of this situation. This happens internally too, meaning the first story you often can tell yourself feels legitimate until you start letting yourself be challenged about it. You know, this happens in all sorts of ways. You know, it may have felt like a betrayal, but then if you actually let your story be challenged, what you might find is that it was a misunderstanding. You know, it might have felt like an attack, but then when you actually let your internal story be challenged, what you might actually discover was just that it was sassiness. Right? Sometimes we feel so strongly about the stone in our hand, and our judgment is actually not clear. And so be cautious when you're holding that stone. When you're ready to throw it at someone, the story may not be as clear as it feels to you. And what's sad is a dad can be doing his best, caring more than you know, trying harder than you realize, and still not get it right every time. And if we're not careful, what we can do is we can take that stone in our hand and we can throw it at someone who's never trying to hurt us in the first place. So this is the innocent and stoned category. You personally may not need to hear this, but chances are some of you might need to hear that. And Jesus calls us into a different way. And then there's the last category. Some dads are guilty. Some dads really did harm. Some dads were not misunderstood, they were wrong. And all of us probably have some concept of this. And yet, when it comes to Jesus, if you've encountered the teachings or the idea of Jesus and even like some abstract, faraway approach, almost anyone, even out on the streets, know that Jesus has this like incredible grace for people. But it's hard to fathom what grace looks like when somebody who is charged with responsibility for taking care of you dropped the ball in a major way. If you were a child and you were harmed and hurt instead of cared for, then that's really hard to figure out. How do I even begin to process how to do the Jesus thing in this broken situation? I mean, even the church itself, throughout the years, even in the Bible, is really clear about the judgment that happens when a father harms the family that they're tasked for caring for. Paul himself teaches Timothy, a young church leader, who he met in Lystra, by the way. He says this in 1 Timothy chapter 5, "But if someone doesn't provide for their own family, and especially for a member of their household, they have denied the faith." But by the way, it doesn't matter what their outward religiosity, it doesn't matter the words that leave their mouth, it doesn't matter the beliefs that they supposedly subscribe to. He says they have denied the faith. They are worse than those that have no faith. And so our faith doesn't deny the facts. It speaks really plainly. And some of you have stories that you can't even share in church. Like the things your dad did are so terrible, people wouldn't even believe if you told them. The fair thing would be a stoning. The fair thing would be to spit when someone says their name. The fair thing would be to move on and never think of them again. But Jesus invites us into something more than fair. Jesus is for the gracious thing. And here's the thing, it's not simply because God invites us to be forgiving to our enemies, but because something happens in our souls when we forgive people. It reminds me of a story from a football player named David Simmons. He played professional football in the 60s and 70s and spent part of his life around the Dallas Cowboys and the St. Louis Cardinals, which I didn't realize was a football team at one point. And he talked about growing up with his incredibly demanding father. When David was a little boy, this is the attitude that his dad had towards him. His dad bought him a bicycle, and the bike was still in the box, and he said to young David, he said, "Here you go, put it together yourself." And David tried, and he struggled as this little boy, and when he couldn't do it, his father said, "I knew you couldn't do it." And he put it together. When later David played football, most kids get nervous before the game. He recounted how he got nervous for after the game, because what would happen is his dad would watch and then take him in their own backyard and then go over every play and point out his flaws and how he failed and the mistakes that he made every game. He said, "Facing my father was more stressful than facing any opposing team." Eventually, David went to college, and by that time, he hated his father. And so he chose the University of Georgia, partially because it was the farthest from home that he could get that offered a scholarship. And then he made it into the pros. He got drafted in the second round by the St. Louis Cardinals the same year that Joe Namath got drafted in the first round. And he recalled calling his dad and being like, "Dad," I telephoned. He called him and said, "Dad, I got drafted." And he said, "How does it feel to be second?" Second round draft. This guy's awful, right? But David became a Christian in college. And God kept working on his heart and how he felt towards his dad, even though his dad didn't deserve it. And for the first time, he felt God nudging him to go talk with his dad and learn more about why he is the way he is. And his dad started telling him stories about his dad. And David's grandfather had been a hard, violent guy. He had a terrible temper. He beat his son. At one point, he once smashed a truck with a sledgehammer because it wouldn't start. And here's how David recalled what this did in his own life. He said, "Knowing about my father's upbringing not only made me more sympathetic for him, But it helped me see that under the circumstances, he might have done much worse. By the time he died, I can honestly say that we were friends. Now, the key part of that story for me is that what changed for David was he met Jesus. Like, he got to know Jesus in college, and Jesus moved his heart. And to let go of the proper and fair and deserved punishment for his dad. That guy deserved to not have a relationship with his son. But instead, he was invited to have some curiosity about who his dad was. And friends, listen, we live in a world today that loves to pick up stones. We cheer when someone picks up a stone. We love doling out the maximum allowable consequences for a mistake. It feels often just and fair after maybe hundreds of years of people getting away with stuff, right? We're eager to rub people's faces in shortcomings. But Jesus still today invites us to unfairness, to not letting people get off the hook necessarily, but naming the reality of things and offering grace. I mean, Desmond Tutu once put it this way. He said, forgiveness does not relieve someone of the responsibility for what they have done, nor does it erase the consequences of wrongdoing. Rather, forgiveness liberates the victim. It actually frees you. This is why Jesus wants us to offer grace to people who don't deserve it. And so, friends, be liberated. At the end of the day, your Father will have to stand before God and explain himself. But that means that you're free to not be the judge here because he's already got a judge. So you get to let it go for your own sake. Whatever it was, you don't have to carry that anymore. You don't have to let that be the primary story of what your dad was like. And so I want to close with this. All of us have different experiences with our dads. And I don't know where you stand with your dad or the memory of your dad or whoever has been dad in your life, but whether he was fantastic or whether he was awful, Jesus still invites you to let him be a human being. Not to make him more than human, not to make him less than human, but to let him be human. A real person with a story and feelings. And so, friends, all I want to say to you to close things off is this. If you want to love a father today, pour out some grace on him. Let him be human. You might be trying to figure out the best gift that a dad can get. I heard another comedian say today, he said, dads are like clams. You don't put a sweater on a clam. Just let the clam be. But here's the thing, you can I don't know what that has to do with it. Just offer grace. That's one of the best gifts that you can give to a dad. Be thankful. And if you still have a good dad in your life, make sure not to take him for granted today, but tell him how much he means to you. Even if the Wi-Fi turns off now and again. Would you pray with me? God, thank you for this day, and even in the complexity of all the different kinds of relationships that we all have with our dads here, or different father figures, God, thank you for the good, and God, may we have supernatural grace for the bad. God, you know that doesn't mean that we don't perhaps have boundaries or limits or consequences to things that he may have done. But God, let there also be forgiveness in our own hearts. So not a single one of us is walking around here with bitterness or hurt. God, with a wound that's still getting picked at. But God, may we instead let the men in our lives be just people. That we don't make them more than human. We don't make them less than human. God, may this Father's Day not just be another holiday that kind of passes by, but may it instead be an opportunity for us to share how much we appreciate the person that we've got, if we appreciate him. And God, if we've got hurt, help us to heal for our own souls and for our own good. God, thank you for the grace that you offer us and may we learn to pour it out for others. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.